All right, we continue in this Gospel Lens series. We may or may not do another week, haven't decided yet. But if I say to you the word work, what does that, like what wells up within you? What emotions does that bring when I say work? Groan. What else? Pressure? Privilege? Yeah? Vocation, accomplishment, hard work, wages. Show me the money, Richard says. Yeah. Um, we spend so much of our time at work, most of us. Most of our lives we spend at work. But I wonder if you've ever stopped to consider how faith and work intersect. Because I think what sometimes we do is we tend to separate faith and work. I think a lot of people actually haven't considered how those two kind of overlap or intersect and the way that they become kind of one and the same. There's this separation of the secular and the spiritual. And this is like from, centuries ago, this has been the case of the church. And even though the whole Protestant Reformation and all that happened, there is still this idea that at times there's the secular stuff and then there's the spiritual stuff. The secular stuff is, the non-church related things that's the school you go to, or it's the sports and the hobbies that you do during the week. It's entertainment. Sorry? It's housework. Feels very secular, doesn't it? Going to the pub with your mates, that's a secular thing, or work. We often just that's in the secular world. Our work is in the secular world, whereas the spiritual things are the church-related stuff. Services, going to Bible studies or prayer groups. Maybe it's youth group or, a playtime kind of thing that's attached to the church. There's a spiritual kind of element to that. What else have I got down there? Yeah, even your own sort of personal devotions, that's your spiritual kind of world. That's often devoid from the secular. And even we probably put family, because as Christians, we place a fair bit of spirituality in our family, and so we put that here. So there's often this separation. But what that does, if we've got the secular and the spiritual, it actually distorts in our minds where God resides. So if this is kind of how we tend to operate our lives, in all this stuff is where God resides. This is the seat that he sits on. And that stuff, maybe he'll dabble in it every so often, but this is where you truly find God. And I think that is a bad distortion for us to have. And what it does is it kind of makes the church the sanctuary, which is that's not a bad metaphor for a church to be, all right? I'm not dismissing that. But it makes that the sanctuary. So it makes over here these things and if we're looking at work particularly today, it makes it like the wilderness. You kind of leave this to go to the sanctuary once a week, or maybe midweek you do a prayer group and there's another little bit of sanctuary. But this is kind of the wilderness, where there isn't a whole lot of spirituality that happens in your life. Is that kind of making sense? And what that does is that diminishes the value of those during the week things. It, in a harsh kind of way, says God's not interested in those. And even worse still, that God is not at work in those kind of spaces. But mentally, we know that's not true. We know God is at work. But we don't always kind of project that. So here's an example which I heard this week on a podcast I was listening to, and I was like, that is 100% correct. All right, so start of this year, Kelsey joined us and we held a commissioning service. All right, her work was going to be here in the church. And so we held this commissioning service. And in the past, you've probably commissioned people going away on mission. No doubt you've commissioned Naomi with her work with YWAM when she was part of that, and others. We commission people that, are in the spiritual space. But recently, and I'm going to pick on Dom, recently Dom got a new job in pharmaceuticals. We didn't commission Dom in that role, and yet that is what God has led her into. That's where God has placed her. But we didn't do any sense of commissioning or praying over her or anything in that kind of role. Why? Well, because God's not interested in those jobs, is he? You see what I'm saying? And I know I'm being a bit maybe facetious and a bit exaggerated in some of what I'm saying, but I think there's a bit of that in us. And so when it comes to how does faith and work intersect, if you don't have one of these more spiritual kind of jobs, then people struggle to see, okay, well, how does God fit in it? How do I, behave as a gospel person in this job? But the reality is, and I said this, we know mentally that God is at work. He's at work here, but he's also very at work in this space as well, in the secular space. Because as we've seen, the gospel is the story of God that unfolds in the world. And it's the story of God that unfolds in the world in every aspect of the world. The whole point of this series is to show that the gospel isn't just this spiritual thing, this spiritual fable over here that a bunch of us hold to. No, it's the story for all of creation. That everyone, whoever it relates to. And it's the story of God that unfolds in every aspect of the world. It speaks to all of life. And Martin Luther, the Martin Luther that nailed the thesis on the door, not the Martin Luther that has a dream. Martin Luther says that if God is at work, he did a whole lot of work on this, but he essentially boils down to this: if God is at work in all the world, which the Psalms and lots of scripture tell us he is, then all of work can actually be seen to be contributing to the work of God. Not just the pastors, not just the missionaries, not just the youth workers, not just the chaplains. All work can be seen to be contributing to the greater work of God. So, an accountant, all right? I was going to point to Judy at this point, but she's not here this morning. But accountants help people be good stewards of the resources they have. They help them live responsibly and with integrity in their business dealings and in their finances. They might help a business that wants to grow and expand in order to better serve their community with whatever product or service that they contribute to society. So accountants help people facilitate some of their work in a better, more integrous way. Or teachers. If you're a teacher, they help students develop understanding. They increase the wonder of children as they, teach them about the world and all that is in it. They nurture and they harness potential. All of that is work of God. That's why he wants people to see the wonder. He wants them to fulfill their potential. He wants to help people have greater understanding. Or a chiro, or a physio, or some other kind of health professional. They're seeking to make people healthy, give people quality of life. Chiros, John helps people free from bondage in their spine. Restoring, healing, those things are the work of God. Admin people are serving and supporting others. That's a part of the gospel story that we live. They bear a burden many times, admin people. They bear the burdens of others in order to allow people to pursue other things. They make way, they remove stumbling blocks, they help processes so there is a better flow. Or people in defense, they protect and they rescue and they support, and we every year we acknowledge the sacrifice that our defense forces give. That's the work of God. When Josh lands a helicopter with people in it, he's doing the work of God. He's keeping them alive, right? Handymans, gardeners, they serve people as well. They help the helpless. They steward creation by, making gardens look lovely. They alert people to delight in creation. That's the work of God. Nurses, doctors, therapists, again, healing, compassion, kindness, tending the broken, providing hope. You see, you could take any kind of profession, any kind of work, and there are ways that work contributes to the work of God in the world. And we've been seeing that one of the key things of the gospel message is that it's whoever believes. It's for whoever. And so when we're talking gospel and work, how does that story relate? Well, it relates to whoever, because anyone is able to actually contribute to the work of God. And so, if you take nothing else away from this message, just chew on that question. Like, if you tune out from now on, that's fine. Just chew on that question. Because if you've never thought about it, meditate on how your work actually contributes to God's gospel work in creation. Because if you start to get an idea of how that actually happens in your work, then I suspect your work will take on a bit of a greater meaning, and your faith will start to intersect a bit more in your workplace. Because it increases meaning, it increases purpose. It possibly increases the intent with which you will carry out your work. And unfortunately, I think sometimes in the church's attempt to help faith and work intersect, we've actually perpetuated this separation. Because we might go, you're, Michelle, you're an admin. Come and do that for the church and add value to your work. Make it spiritual by doing it for the church. Meaning, Michelle's admin over here, but do it for the church, and it takes on this meaning. Or, teacher, great, come and teach our kingdom kids. Or, you're a dentist, fantastic, well, head overseas with this mission trip and provide some dental work to people doing it tough in poor communities. Nothing wrong with that, but if that's the only time we kind of show value and kind of say that's you using your work for God, when they're doing it in the spiritual space, then we're actually perpetuating this idea that unless we're doing it in the church kind of context, God's not as in it. But I want to a whole bunch of you go, I'm retired, I can tune out, I'm not listening to Noel this morning. Woo! Wrong, because here's the definition of work. I'm not necessarily talking just paid employment. When I'm talking work, it's more than paid employment. Paul uses the term in Philippians, fruitful labor. And in 1 Corinthians 10, verse 31, there's also that famous verse that says, do everything for the glory of God. So whatever you do it for the glory of God. And Cara Martin, who's written a couple of books that are called Workship, which is around this whole conversation of intersecting faith and work, she kind of talks about work as something with intent and purpose, something that you do that's with intent and purpose. And so the value of work is actually, when we're talking work, it's not just determined by whether you're paid or not. And the world will actually tell us the importance of your work increases as the pay packet increases. That tends to be just an underlying message in society. But the reality is some of the most valuable work, some of the most meaningful work, some of the most fruitful labor that you may be involved with, you may never actually get a cent for. Or you may pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to do it, like parenting, for example. Or caring for elderly parents or relatives. There's no remuneration in that. But is that fruitful labour? Is that good work that contributes to the work of God? Absolutely it is. Or if you're currently studying, well, that's fruitful labour. That's going to bear fruit for years to come as you study in whatever profession it is that you are pursuing. Or if you are someone who is retired, I can vividly picture, I couldn't find a photo of my Popo with this t-shirt on, but when he retired, my mum gave him this t-shirt and he wore it all the time. He loved it. But this is what it said on it. It said, retired? No, just retired. See, my Pop, when he retired, he didn't really stop. He just kept doing all sorts of fruitful labour, but it was just a different kind of space. It wasn't paid, and it gave him freedom to do other things, but he just went and he still served and he still helped and he still did a whole bunch of things that contributed to the work of God. And so if someone's retired, it's not that, oh, okay, my fruitful labour, my work has finished. No, it continues. There is still opportunity for fruitful labour. But I do want to acknowledge that for many people, retirement, and the reason why, that retired is actually quite apt, is because a lot of people struggle, I think, at retirement because their identity has been so wrapped up in their work, their paid work. And so when that's no longer there, they're kind of like, well, who am I? What kind of person am I to be? Like, what do I give myself to? And I think that is one of the traps of work, is finding our identity in it. Whereas the gospel story reminds us that our identity is elsewhere. We are more than just our profession. And that our identity is actually in Jesus. We've said this a few times about some of the topics we've looked at in the gospel series, because the gospel lens talks about like God gave. There's a great gift to the gospel story. And work's no different. Work is actually a gift that God gives. Margaret said work's a privilege. That's right. Work is actually something which was good in the creation account. All right? God makes creation. He makes humans in his image, then gives them some labour to do. Now, before the fall, there was still labour. After the fall, that labour became very hard, and they had to toil. But before the fall, there was still labour. They still had to tend to creation. And when God had finished all that, what did he say? It is very good. So work was in that picture. And there is something good about work. Ecclesiastes, despite a lot of its message saying meaningless, everything's meaningless, and a bit of doom and gloom, Ecclesiastes actually has a fair bit in it about enjoy your work, enjoy the fruits of your labour and enjoy all that. However, even if work is a good thing, like all good things, we can distort that. We can misuse that, and they become less than good. So for work, one of the things which it often becomes for people is a burden. All right? It becomes this work type thing. And I get that, all right? That happens in the spiritual space as well. People's, we just, there's a burden to it. And that often happens when these are separate, when we kind of think they are separate. It becomes this burden because, like I said, this kind of is the wilderness, but this is the space where the life and the meaning really truly happens. And if we kind of have this idea that there's less meaning in these spaces, or that we assign meaning to different things, like it's just about the paycheck and that's all our meaning, our work is for us, then that's when it becomes a burden. The other idea, though, is that instead of these being separate, sometimes the secular or our work is put ahead of Christ. And so it's not a necessary burden, but work becomes an idol. Because when we put work in front of God, it's not necessarily separate, it's just that that's given a greater priority. And we see work as good, not because it's as a gift from God and as a means for things, but we see it as good because of the status, the wealth, the identity, the things that it gives us. And we chase after those elements of our work. Now I'm going to share an example from a pastor colleague of mine. I'm just going to say up the front, I may be really judgy in this, and I'm just acknowledging that up the front. But this pastor colleague of mine had a sports car, and on his sports car, which is a very flashy sports car that many pastors don't have, he had a number plate that said Rev, because he was a reverend. It wasn't anything to do with Rev Head or anything, it was Rev because he was a reverend. And he would drive this around. Now, there's part of me that wonders why he felt the need to flash on this flashy car that he was a reverend. I've spent all my life trying to keep that quiet, that I'm a reverend. I only use it on official documents. I have to use it. And yet here, this is me. And I wonder, this is the judgy bit, I wonder whether there's too much of his identity wrapped up in that. And even though pastoring work is good, spiritual work, maybe there's too much of an idol of that element because it gives a bit of status, it gives a bit of authority. And in the creation account, we see God institute the pattern of Sabbath. Why? Because he knew the threat of work becoming an idol and getting in the way of people's spiritual lives. And so he built in creation this pattern of Sabbath, of taking a rest, of dropping it for a day at least, to actually focus on what is important. So you don't want the separation, you don't want this. What you actually want with faith and work is an integration. Oops. You want an integration. Because work is good and it can be used for the glory of God to contribute to his work. And so you want to start to understand how those two integrate. What are some ways, though, that you might be able to assist with integrating faith and work? Have a think yourself. I can open it up in a minute, but here's some of my thoughts. I think prayer is the simple, easiest way to start integrating your faith into work. Because in prayer, what we're essentially doing is inviting God to lead in whatever we're praying into. And so, when it comes to work, if we're inviting him to lead us in that, then the integration happens better. But I don't know whether that could be that maybe you set an alarm at specific times during the day so that you remind yourself to stop and to pray. On the commute to work, if you're a commuter, maybe that's where you just pray about the day and what's coming up and the people that you're going to encounter. Maybe you're about to head to granny daycare for the day. Yeah, well, just start that day with a prayer of thank you, God, for the privilege and the opportunity to invest in your grandchildren and to see opportunities to share some of who he is in that. All right, I don't know, how you do that, but just having set times that you bring prayer into that space. Or maybe at crucial decisions. Maybe your go-to is, I'm not sure where to go, I'm going to go to my manager, my supervisor. Well, maybe before you do that, go to the manager, the supervisor first before you go and have that conversation. Just seek his wisdom on some crucial decisions. I think one of the other ways is that the ethics with which you do your work they should be God-determined ethics. There are stories in the Bible that point to this. Joseph comes to mind, right? He gets sold into slavery by his brothers because they're jealous. And instead of being bitter and twisted and, you know, throwing his hands up and just behaving however he wanted, he allowed God to determine his ethics in that place. He worked hard. He, even when Potiphar's wife, threw herself at him, he remained integrous and said no. There was all sorts of ways that he allowed God to determine his ethics. And over, God blessed him for that. And just when you think, how many times can Joseph get knocked down? He would get back up again. God would kind of give him away because of his faithfulness to these God's ways. Or Daniel's the same. Daniel and his mates, when they get taken into exile. All right? There's all sorts of people taken into exile, but this small group get chosen. Why? Because of their ethics that they showed in serving what was essentially their enemies. In the New Testament, Paul writes, which he gets a bit of a bad rap for, to slaves a number of times, encouraging them to serve their masters faithfully. That doesn't mean he champions slavery, but what he is saying is in that workplace, do it with this good work ethic. As a pastor, I've sat with a few folks who have fallen in this space where they haven't allowed God to determine their ethics. They've stolen and they're being charged, or they've done some other thing that's meant they've lost their job. Allow God to determine your ethics, and that will allow faith to really integrate with your work. And Christ reflecting values as well. So as we've talked about a lot, the gospel is for whoever. If you are a business owner or have the opportunity to employ people, then maybe there is opportunity in Christ reflecting values to employ other people that others deem unemployable. Now, you've got to be wise and sensible about that. I get that. But maybe there's opportunity to be generous in that way. I worked for a furniture warehouse when I first got down here. It's up in Warrawong. And the business owner is a Christian. And Sundays in a furniture shop would be one of your busiest days, Because Joe and Mary, they wake up on Sunday morning and go, oh, we've been meaning to get a new couch. Do you want to go, love? Yep, all right. And they go on their Sunday. But because of his faith and the need for Sabbath, that warehouse is shut on Sundays. Probably one of the days that they would sell the most. But God has blessed that business because that's a value that continues to shape that business. I was listening to a Tim Keller podcast on this, and he told the story about how he met someone in his church who he said, well, how did you come to be at this church? And she told the story of her manager. She had just started in this role. It was in the film and television industry. And she made some big mistake, which basically cost the business a bunch. And she was fearful for her job. Anyway, the manager essentially went to the higher-ups and just said, no, it's probably my fault. I didn't train her well enough. And basically took the hit on her behalf. And she went to him and said, why'd you do that? Like everyone else in this industry takes credit, but they don't take credit for the mistakes. They take credit for the work you do to get ahead. Why did you do that? And he just fobbed it off a few times, but eventually the manager said, well, I had enough collateral with enough trust in the bank with these people that I knew I could afford it. But it was too expensive for you, essentially, to take the hit. He said, the reason I did it mostly, though, is because Jesus took the hit for me. And I want to reflect that value in how I relate to people. So I took the hit for you. Let's not do it again. Let's be better. Let's go ahead. Anyway, she became a Christian because of that and came to this church. So Christ reflecting values can speak a lot. And I've put there a sent mentality. And what I mean by that is, you know, the people that are sent are not just the ones here in this spiritual space, us pastors, missions, chaplains, whatever. They're not the only ones that are sent. All of us are sent. Anyone who says, I'm a follower of Jesus, has been sent out into the world. So if whatever profession, whatever work, whether that's looking after grandkids, whether that's housework, whether that's paid employment of some type, that's where God has sent you. And if you take that mentality, you'll understand how faith and work intersect a lot more. One of the other kind of flow-on effects of that is that work can then be, you'll see work as a gospel declaration. So St. John Paul II said this: excellence in one's work is the foundation of effective evangelization. And so as we've been looking at this series, it's not just about how does it help us see the world, but how can we be people that take the gospel into these kind of scenarios. So for work, excellence, good ethics, good values as we go about the work is actually a way of declaring the gospel. Why? One, because you kind of take that attitude of serving. That's what the gospel is all about. Christ selflessly, sacrificially serving us. If you take that attitude, that speaks loudly and you gain credibility. So then when you may actually use words to speak about the gospel, people are prepared to listen because of the credibility that you've built up. I haven't had a whole lot of, and I know I'm perpetuating the separation, I haven't had a whole lot of secular jobs, but one of the ones that I did have was just in retail, just while I was going through Bible college. And I got the job from another guy who was at my church. He just said, we're looking for some work, come and work here. So I applied for that job and got it. Anyway, the manager of that store was good friends with this guy at the church and his family. And so they would come occasionally to various kind of events and things. This church family were, this was one of their targets of sharing the gospel with. Anyway, at Troy was the guy's name I worked with, at Troy's wedding. The manager, I overheard him talking with Troy's parents and saying, I always, of all the workers I had, I always knew that I could rely on Noel and Troy. Like, they're trustworthy, they aren't going to do anything dodgy, they would be there on time, I could just not worry when they were there. And that was just, that's expressing, as far as I'm aware, they never became Christians, but there was this credibility. There was something they noticed in us as, we were, this is 18, 19-year-old guys. Others of that age in this shop, got up to some funny business. But there was something that separated us. And that's what I'm saying, just that good work ethic, the gospel actually colouring how we work can actually speak really loudly when we can then voice the message of Jesus. I'm going to wrap up there. But I want to encourage you, whatever your work is, paid or otherwise, to just think about how does it contribute to the work of God. Because God is at work in it, and he wants to encourage you in that. Let me pray, and we might just finish the service there, I think, Wayne. Thanks, mate. So, Jesus, I thank you that you are with us everywhere. And that actually this kind of space that we call church is a very small part of what you are up to in the world. And help us not to forget that. Help us to not get swept up in that idea, but to actually see how you are at work in all things. And as we go out into our week, whether that's paid employment, whether it's volunteer work, whether it's just stuff around the house or with extended family, may you just show us how it is that we contribute and participate with you in your work in this world. I thank you that you meet us wherever, that you speak to us wherever, and you can use us wherever. and that your gospel tells us that whoever believes. And so not only is it a privilege to work, but it is particularly a privilege to be someone sent by you to speak and demonstrate the goodness of God. So help us in that endeavour, well up that courage within us, and allow us to do that faithfully, we pray. Amen. Be blessed. Come and have a cup of tea and a conversation, and stick around for the meeting if you can.